The gun was already pressed against Letitia Wallace's temple when the sheriff of Calder's Creek walked through the saloon doors. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching at guns a long time ago, somewhere between Abilene and Dodge City, somewhere between the third town that had run her out and the fifth one that had spat at her feet. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders because the man holding the weapon had ripped her traveling hat away before she could speak a single word in her own defense. The crowd around her had that familiar shape, that familiar lean, the bodies pressing inward with the specific hunger of people who had already decided what they wanted to see. "Get her out," someone in the back was saying. "Get her out before she poisons this town the same way she poisoned the last one." Letitia's eyes were fixed on the middle distance. Her hands were raised. Her bag, the worn leather one that held everything she owned in the world, was at her feet, and she had been calculating whether she could grab it and run before the man with the gun made a decision that could not be undone. Then the doors opened. He was not what she expected. She had expected, based on 15 months of traveling through the territories, another broad man with a face like a fist, a badge that might as well have been a weapon itself. What stepped through the doors of the Rattlesnake Saloon in Calder's Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, was a man who moved like someone who had learned very early that the world rewards stillness. Tall, with dark hair threaded at the temples with a premature silver that made him look like a man who had seen things he could not put down. He had a lean jaw and eyes that were a very quiet shade of gray, and those eyes took in the entire room in one slow sweep before they settled on Letitia. "Roy," said the sheriff. His voice was low, not loud. It did not need to be loud. "Put that down." The man pressing the gun to Letitia's temple, Roy apparently, made a sound that was half defiance and half something more complicated. "She is the Wallace woman, Sheriff Rourke. She is the one from the posters." "I know who she is," said the sheriff, whose name was Isaiah Rourke. He had not moved any closer. He was standing just inside the door with his thumbs hooked lightly into his gun belt, and he was looking at Letitia with an expression she could not immediately read. "Put the gun down, Roy." She is wanted in connection with an inquiry," Isaiah said. "That is a very different thing. And even if she were wanted in 10 territories, you do not get to hold a gun to an unarmed woman's head in my town. Put it down." There was a long moment. Letitia counted her own heartbeats. She was very good at that, having had considerable practice. Roy lowered the gun. Isaiah Rourke walked across the room, and the crowd parted for him in a way it had never once parted for Letitia. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with those gray eyes, and she waited for the thing that always came next. The pointed finger, the word she had been called in a dozen different ways in a dozen different towns, the escorted walk to the edge of wherever she was, and the instruction not to come back. Bent down and picked up her traveling bag. He held it out to her. "You look like you have not eaten," he said. Letitia stared at him. "There is a boarding house on the corner of 2nd and Main," he continued. "Mrs. Aldridge runs it. Tell her Isaiah sent you. There is a diner 2 doors east of that, best beef stew in the county." "You are not running me out," Letitia said. It was not a question. She said it the way someone says a thing they do not quite believe, testing the sound of it in the air. "No," said Isaiah Rourke simply. "I am not." She had stood in that moment for what felt like a very long time, and the saloon around them was absolutely silent, and she had taken the bag from his hands and felt the strange, disorienting shock of a kindness she had not prepared herself for. That was 3 weeks ago. Now she needed to understand how she had arrived at this moment, standing in the doorway of a saloon with a gun at her head in the first place, because the answer to that question was the whole long and complicated story of Letitia Wallace's life. She had been born in 1858 in St. Louis, Missouri, to a seamstress mother and a father who worked at the river docks. It was a quiet life, not wealthy but not wanting, and she had grown up with ink-stained fingers from the books she borrowed, and a mind that her mother called restless and her father called sharp. She was educated past what most girls of her station expected, because her father believed with a stubborn and somewhat inconvenient conviction that his daughter deserved to understand the world she was living in. When she was 19, she had married James Wallace. It had seemed at the time like a reasonable thing. James was a businessman, or he called himself one, and he had money enough and charm enough that the details of his business stayed pleasantly vague for the first year of their marriage. He was not a cruel man, she would say that. He was not cruel. He was simply dishonest in a way that spread outward like a stain, and by the time Letitia understood the full shape of what he was, she was already inside it. James Wallace ran schemes. The particular flavor changed depending on where they were and what the local need was, but the structure was always the same. Promises made with great conviction, money collected, promises abandoned. He was extraordinarily good at it. He had a face people trusted and hands that never shook when he shook yours, and a way of looking at a person that made them feel chosen. Letitia had felt chosen too. She knew that now. In the spring of 1880, James Wallace vanished. He did not leave a note. He took what money remained and he left, and Letitia was left behind in Wichita, Kansas, with nothing but a last name that had started to circulate in the wrong way. Because when people found out that the promises had been empty, when they found out that the money was gone, they looked at the wife. They always looked at the wife. She had tried to explain. She had tried in Wichita and in Abilene and in Dodge City and in Sweetwater and in 4 other towns whose names she now tried not to remember, to explain that she had not known, that she had been as deceived as anyone, that she had her own losses, her own money gone, her own name dragged through the same mud as theirs. No one wanted to hear it. Or rather, they heard it and they did not believe it, because it was more satisfying to have a villain present than to have a villain absent, and James Wallace had made himself very thoroughly absent. There were posters. That was the thing that followed her like a shadow with teeth. Not arrest warrants exactly, not in most jurisdictions, but inquiry posters, inquiry into the business dealings of one James and Letitia Wallace, which sounded, to anyone who glanced at one quickly, like an arrest warrant. People did not read posters carefully. They read the name and the word inquiry and the word Wallace, and they made their conclusions. And so she traveled. She was looking for something, though she had not always been able to name it clearly. Partly, she was looking for a place to stop. Partly she was looking, though she would not have admitted this in Wichita or Abilene or Dodge or anywhere else that had turned her out, for evidence of James himself, because somewhere in the back of her mind, there was still the thin, cold wish to look him in the eye and say the things she had never got to say. Calder's Creek was the 17th town. She had ridden in on the stage from San Angelo on a Tuesday in early April. The land around Calder's Creek was West Texas at its most argumentative, flat in some directions, and then suddenly rudely interrupted by limestone ridges, the sky too large above it all, the kind of sky that makes a person feel either free or terrifyingly exposed, depending on what they are carrying. The town itself was small but not dying. There was a general store and a land office and a church and 3 saloons, which told her something about the local priorities, and a rail spur that came through twice a week, connecting them to the larger world. She had stepped off the stage with her bag and her hat, and the careful neutral expression she had developed as armor, and she had gone to the first saloon she saw, not to drink, but because saloons always had notice boards and she needed to know if her name had arrived before her. It had. The man who had grabbed her arm, Roy Tesler, was the owner of one of the saloons and also, as she would learn later, one of the men who had lost money in a deal James had run in this very county 2 years prior. He had recognized her name from the poster the moment she gave it to the barkeeper. He had not given her a chance to do anything else. And then Isaiah Rourke had walked through the door. She thought about that walk, about the particular quality of his stillness, many times in the days that followed while she settled into Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, and tried to determine whether this reprieve was real or whether it was the kind of cruelty that makes you comfortable before it dismantles you. Mrs. Aldridge was a woman of about 50 with iron-colored hair and a no-nonsense manner that Letitia found deeply comforting after months of uncertainty. She did not ask questions beyond the necessary. She set Letitia up in a room at the back with a window that looked out at a small kitchen garden and a view of the limestone ridge in the distance, and she charged a fair rate, and that was that. The town watched Letitia. She could feel it, the eyes that tracked her when she walked to the diner, the conversations that dipped and shifted when she came within earshot. It was not entirely hostile. It was more complicated than that. There was hostility, yes, from Roy Tesler, and from 2 or 3 others she identified early as men who had dealings with James. But there was also curiosity, and in some faces she caught something that might have been sympathy or might have been the neutral observation of people watching a situation unfold to see how it would go. She met Isaiah Rourke properly for the first time 3 days after her arrival. He came to the boarding house in the late afternoon, hat in hand, and Mrs. Aldridge showed him to the small parlor where Letitia was mending one of her 2 good dresses because she needed to make them last. He sat across from her and he was quiet for a moment and she waited. "I want to be honest with you," he said finally, "because I think you have had enough of people who were not." She looked at him. She kept her face still. "The poster on you is an inquiry document," he continued. "It is not a warrant. I have checked. You are not a fugitive in the legal sense, which means no one in this town has any legal authority to detain you or remove you. I have made that clear to Roy Tesler and to anyone else who needed to hear it." "You checked," she said. "I sent a wire to the territorial marshal's office the same afternoon you arrived," he said. He looked at her directly, with those gray eyes that she was already beginning to think of as the most honest eyes she had encountered in a very long time. "I wanted to know what I was working with." "And what are you working with?" "A woman who appears to have been left holding the consequences of someone else's dishonesty," he said. Letitia set down the dress she was mending. She pressed her hands flat against her knees and looked at him and felt the very specific ache of a kindness that costs you something, because accepting it means admitting how badly you needed it. "My husband was not a good man," she said. "I did not know that when I married him. I know it may be difficult to believe that." "Many people have found it difficult to believe." "Why?" he asked. She blinked. "Excuse me. Why do you assume I would find it difficult to believe?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because in my experience," she said carefully, "people tend to believe that a wife knows what her husband does." Isaiah Rourke was quiet. He turned his hat in his hands once, just once, a slow rotation. "My father was a drunk," he said. "A mean one, not a violent one, but the kind that erodes things quietly. My mother did not know that when she married him either. She was not ignorant. She was not weak. She was simply handed a set of facts she had not been given the chance to evaluate before the commitment was made." He looked up. "People believe what they want to believe. It usually has more to do with them than with the truth." She did not know what to do with him. That was the thing about Isaiah Rourke that she kept coming back to in those early days. She did not know what to do with him. She had built a very thorough set of expectations about what men in authority in frontier towns were like, and he kept failing to confirm them. He was 31. He had been sheriff of Calder's Creek for 4 years, having come up through the deputy ranks under the previous sheriff, a man named Garrett who had retired to the eastern part of the state to live with his daughter. Isaiah had grown up in this part of Texas, son of the town drunk, and a woman who had worked as a schoolteacher until her husband's reputation had made that untenable. He had watched his mother be diminished by association for years. He did not say this to Letitia, not yet, not in that first meeting. She would learn it in pieces, the way you learn the shape of a country by walking through it, one piece of ground at a time. What he did say in that first meeting was this: "You can stay in Calder's Creek as long as you need to. If anyone gives you trouble, you come to me directly. The law in this town is administered by law, not by the mood of whoever is loudest." She walked back to her room afterward, and sat on the edge of her bed with her hands clasped in her lap, and thought about how strange it was that a sentence as simple as that could feel like oxygen. The weeks settled into a shape. Letitia was practical in a way that years of surviving had honed. She needed income. She found it, after some careful navigation of the social landscape, in two forms. First, she offered her sewing skills to Mrs. Aldridge, who was grateful enough that she reduced the room rate accordingly. Second, she went to the general store, run by a taciturn German-American man named Wilhelm Hess, and asked if he needed any help with his accounts. He looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment and then said, "Can you add?" "I can do considerably more than add," she said. He hired her 3 days a week. It was not lavish, but it was enough, and it was hers, and that mattered more than the money. The social architecture of Calder's Creek began to reveal itself to her in the way of small towns, gradually, through the accumulation of small observations. Roy Tesler remained hostile, but had been constrained by Isaiah's clear and public statement of her legal status. There was a woman named Clara Beaumont, who was the wife of the land office owner, who watched Letitia with a complicated expression that eventually resolved itself into tentative friendliness, and who one afternoon appeared at the general store and bought 6 yards of calico, and then lingered by the counter as if she had something to say and eventually said it. Which was that she was sorry for the way Letitia had been treated when she arrived, and that she personally did not believe everything she heard about other people. "Thank you," Letitia said, and meant it without reservation. Clara Beaumont became something close to a friend over the following weeks. She was a warm and somewhat anxious woman who had been born in this town, and could not quite imagine living anywhere else. And she was fascinated by Letitia, in the way of someone who has never left a place being fascinated by someone who has seen much of the world, even if the seeing had not always been pleasant. They sat on the porch of the boarding house on warm evenings sometimes, Clara and Letitia, and drank the coffee that Mrs. Aldridge provided and watched the last light go off the limestone ridge. And Letitia found that she was becoming something she had not been in a very long time, which was settled. Not in the sense of having given up. In the sense of having, temporarily at least, put down the constant readiness to flee. Isaiah appeared in her days with a regularity that was, she eventually admitted to herself, not entirely the result of professional responsibility. The sheriff of a small town had legitimate reasons to check in on new residents, particularly ones whose arrival had been dramatic. But there were morning greetings that were longer than they needed to be. There were occasions when he stopped outside the general store window, and she looked up from the accounts, and their eyes met through the glass, and he nodded, and she nodded, and something passed between them that was not nothing. There were evenings when he walked back from his rounds and happened to go by the boarding house porch at exactly the time she happened to be sitting on it. She was not naive about what was happening. She was also not ready. She had been burned badly enough by James Wallace, by the specific mistake of trusting someone she did not fully know, that she carried a wariness around her heart like a second skin. Isaiah was kind. He was fair. He had been the first person in 17 towns to see her as a person, rather than a problem to be solved. But kindness alone was not enough to make her lower her guard, and she had learned that lesson at a cost she could still feel in her bones. What began to lower her guard was not kindness but honesty. It was a Thursday evening in late April, coming on toward May, with the air still cool enough to want a shawl but warm enough to promise the summer beyond. She had been sitting on the porch, and he had come by after his evening rounds, and she had offered him the second chair and he had sat in it, and they had been quiet together for a while in the way of two people who do not need to fill silence urgently. He said, out of nowhere, the way people say things when they have been holding them for a while, "I almost left Calder's Creek 3 years ago." She turned to look at him. "There was a situation," he said, "where I had to arrest a man who was well liked in this town, well connected. He had done something that needed to be answered for, and everyone around me, including the mayor and the bank owner and several other people whose opinion carries weight here, made it very clear that they thought I should look the other way. "What did you do?" she asked. "I arrested him," he said. There was a period of about 6 months after that where my position here was genuinely uncertain. People who had been friendly were not friendly. There were suggestions that my term would not be renewed. I thought about leaving, finding a different town, starting over somewhere that did not already have a story about me. "But you stayed." "I stayed," he said, "partly because running from it felt wrong, partly because I had not actually done anything wrong and I did not think I should have to pay the price of someone else's discomfort with that." He paused. "And partly because this town is mine in a way, for better and worse. I grew up here. My mother is buried here. Whatever this place is, it is also what made me, and I was not willing to let the worst version of it drive me away from the best version." She was quiet, thinking about that. "I tell you this," he said, "not because I think it is the same as your situation. What you have been through is different. You did not choose the thing that followed you, I know that." He looked at the ridge, painted orange and lavender in the failing light. "I tell you because I want you to know that I understand something about what it is to be defined by a story that someone else wrote about you." She felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not the way books described it. Quietly, the way something that has been locked for a long time makes a small sound when the mechanism finally gives. "My mother used to say," Letitia said, "that people are stories walking around. That what you have to do is figure out which parts of the story are actually yours and which parts other people wrote on you without asking." She sounds like a wise woman. "She was," Letitia said. "She died when I was 23, before James, before all of it." She paused. "Sometimes I think she was lucky not to have to watch it." Isaiah turned to look at her then, and his expression was not pity. She was grateful for that because she could not have tolerated pity. It was something more careful, more considered, something that looked at her like a person rather than a circumstance. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Not right now, in the larger sense." She thought about it for a long moment. "I have been looking for James," she said honestly. "I have been telling myself it is because I want to clear my name formally, which is true. But it is also because I need to say the things I never got to say. And beneath that," she said and stopped. "Beneath that," he prompted gently. "Beneath that I am looking for a place where I am not the problem," she said. "A place where I am just a person. Where I can wake up in the morning and do the day and not spend every hour trying to prove that I deserve to be standing on the ground I am standing on." He was quiet. "This might be it," she said, and then she heard herself say it and felt suddenly exposed, and she looked back at the ridge. "I think it might be," he said. She did not look at him, but she was smiling, small and private, facing away. May brought warm days and a steady commerce of life. The town had a rhythm that Letitia had been outside of for so long that stepping into it felt like learning to walk after a long stillness. She had taken on additional sewing work, as Clara Beaumont had spread word of her skill, and there were 3 women in town who came to her for alterations, and one who wanted a dress made from scratch for her daughter's wedding in the summer. It was the kind of work that required a whole self, not just hands, and she found that she was grateful for it. She learned more about Isaiah in pieces. She learned that he had a dog, a large and deeply self-satisfied hound named Ezra, who accompanied him on his morning rounds with the air of an official deputy. She learned that he read, which was not universal in the territory. He had a shelf of books in the small house. The town provided for the sheriff that he had accumulated over the years, and he had a habit of carrying one in his coat pocket. She learned that he cooked adequately but without inspiration, that he had a slight scar on his left hand from a fence wire incident when he was 12, and that he had a quality of attention when he was listening to someone that made you feel, in a way that was very rare, as though what you were saying was the only thing in the room. She also learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that there was a dark thread in his past that he had not yet told her the full shape of. It came to the surface gradually, the way a current comes to the surface of a river in certain conditions. She noticed that he never spoke of any family other than his parents. She noticed that there were moments when he looked at the horizon with an expression that was not the usual stillness but something more like grief with a lid on it. She noticed that there was a photograph on his shelf, a small one in a tin frame, that he did not explain and that she did not ask about. She asked Clara Beaumont about it, not directly, but in the way of a careful question embedded in a larger conversation. Clara was quiet for a moment and then said, "He was engaged." About 5 years ago. Her name was Martha Oakes from San Angelo. She came down with fever in the winter of '77. It was very fast. Letitia absorbed this. "He took it hard," Clara said. "He does not speak about it. But you can see it sometimes. There are men who close up when that kind of thing happens and stay closed. Isaiah did not stay closed, but it cost him something. You can see that too." This explained something she had been trying to name in him, a quality of knowing that coexisted with his natural steadiness, the way a person who has been through a particular kind of loss carries it not as dysfunction but as depth. She found herself thinking about it more than she perhaps should, found herself turning it over the way you turn a stone to see what is underneath. The confrontation she had been waiting for arrived in the second week of May. Roy Tesler had not gone away. He had been constrained by Isaiah's authority, but constraint is not dissolution, and she had known from the first day that he was the kind of man who would wait rather than abandon a grievance. She was coming out of the general store on a Wednesday afternoon when he was waiting on the boardwalk, not alone. He had 2 men with him she did not know, and their positioning was the specific positioning of people who want to block movement without touching anyone. "Mrs. Wallace," he said, and the way he said it was a violation all by itself, the particular sneer that transmits meaning without language. She stopped. She looked at him directly. She had learned a long time ago that looking away was read as weakness. "Mr. Tesler," she said, "I have been doing some thinking," he said, "about the fact that you are still here, and the fact that our sheriff seems to have some reason to keep you here that I have not been able to quite figure out. The reason," she said evenly, "is that I am a law-abiding person and there is no legal basis for removing me. Your husband took $400 from me," he said, and now the sneer was gone and something rower was underneath it. $400 for a business venture that did not exist. I want to know where that money is." "So do I," she said. "James Wallace took money from me too. He took my savings and he took the first 2 years of my life that I gave to him under false pretenses. You are not the only person who lost something." He stared at her. She could see that this genuinely had not occurred to him. "Your husband is gone," he said. "You are here, someone should answer." "I agree completely," she said. "James Wallace should answer. When you find him, I would be grateful for the news." She stepped around him and kept walking and did not run. She was very proud of herself for not running. She went directly to the sheriff's office, because she had promised Isaiah she would come to him directly if there was trouble, and she kept her promises. He was at his desk when she came in, writing out some document with the careful attention he gave to everything, and he looked up and saw her face and put down his pen. She told him what had happened. She was precise and calm, and she reported it like the account keeper she was, events in sequence, nothing added or subtracted. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "He did not touch you." "No, he was careful about that." Isaiah sat back and was quiet for a moment. "Tesler is not going to hurt you," he said. "I want you to understand that, not because he is a good man, but because he is a careful man and he knows what the consequences would be." He paused, "But I am going to have a conversation with him." "I do not need you to fight my battles," she said, and heard the sharpness in her own voice and softened it. "I appreciate it. I simply want you to know that I am not asking you to." He looked at her with those gray eyes. "I know you are not asking," he said. "I am telling you what I am going to do as your sheriff, which is the same thing I would do for any resident of this town who was being harassed. It is not special treatment. It is the job." She looked at him for a moment and then nodded. He had that conversation with Roy Tesler the same afternoon. She did not know exactly what was said, but whatever it was had the quality of a door being firmly closed, because Roy Tesler did not approach her again after that. He continued to exist in the town with his simmering resentment, which she considered his private business, but the active harassment stopped. She was grateful. She was also aware that she was becoming more than grateful, and this was the thing she needed to think carefully about. She sat with it the way she sat with accounts, spreading it out and looking at the numbers honestly. Isaiah Rourke was a good man. She believed that now with a conviction that surprised her with its solidity. He was good in the way that was not performance, not the elaborate display of goodness that James had perfected, but the quiet functional goodness of a person who has made their choices and lives inside them. He was also a man she found genuinely interesting, which was rarer than people supposed. And he made her feel, when she was near him, a warmth that she recognized as the kind of warmth worth being careful about. The being careful about it was the problem. Or rather, the fact that she was still being careful about it was the problem, because she could feel herself wanting to stop being careful, and she was not yet sure it was safe. The question of James Wallace came back to the surface in a way she had not expected, and it came in the form of a letter. It arrived on the stage from San Angelo in the third week of May, addressed to her in care of Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house, which meant someone knew where she was. She took it to her room and sat on the bed and looked at it for a long time before she opened it. The letter was from a lawyer in San Antonio. His name was Bernard Holloway, and he had been engaged. He wrote, by a party who wished to remain anonymous, to inform Mrs. Letitia Wallace of the following facts: that James Wallace had been apprehended by federal marshals in the territory of New Mexico in March of 1882 and was currently held awaiting trial on charges of fraud across multiple states and territories. That the proceedings against Mrs. Wallace in her personal capacity had been dropped by all parties who had filed them, as James Wallace himself had made a statement to federal authorities confirming that his wife had no knowledge of or participation in his schemes, and that Mrs. Wallace was advised to present herself at her earliest convenience to the nearest federal marshal's office with this letter, whereupon her name would be formally cleared and all inquiry posters rescinded. Letitia read the letter 3 times. She sat with it in her hands for a very long time. She thought about Wichita. She thought about the 400 miles of road between there and here, the names she had been called and the doors that had been closed and the guns that had been pressed against her. She thought about 17 towns that had all resolved to the same answer, which was no. She thought about Isaiah Rourke walking through the saloon doors. She did not cry. She was not sure she had the capacity anymore. But she sat on the edge of her bed in the room at Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house with the letter in her hands and the late afternoon light coming through the window, and she breathed. Then she put the letter in her bag and she went to find Isaiah. He was not at his office. Mrs. Aldridge, when asked, said she had seen the sheriff heading toward the south end of town, which was the direction of the livery stable, and beyond it the open ground where the limestone ridge started to rise. She found him there, sitting on a flat rock at the base of the ridge with Ezra the hound beside him, looking out at the flat country spread below. He heard her coming because he always heard things coming, and he turned. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. He read it carefully the way he did everything, and when he looked up his expression had shifted into something she could not quite name. "This is what you have been waiting for," he said. "Yes," she said. There was a silence. "Congratulations," he said, and the word was genuine. "Letitia." He said her name with a care that struck her because he did not often use it. He usually said Mrs. Wallace in public, and did not say much of anything in the private moments they had, which were mostly silence anyway. The name in his mouth sounded like something being treated gently. "This is what you deserved from the beginning." "I need to go to the marshal's office," she said, "in San Angelo to complete the process." "I will write you a letter of safe conduct," he said immediately. From this office testifying to your good standing and legal status, it will help." She looked at him. "Isaiah." He was looking at the ridge. "What are you thinking?" she asked. A pause. "I am thinking," he said, "that you came to this town looking for a place to stop, and that now you have what you need to stop anywhere." He turned and looked at her directly, and the gray eyes held something he was being very careful about. "I am thinking about what that means for where you choose to stop." She sat down on the rock beside him. Ezra, the deeply self-satisfied hound, moved one large paw in acknowledgement and otherwise did not shift. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right." "When I came to Calder's Creek," she said, "I was looking for a place to stop. You are right about that. And this was supposed to be the same as the other towns. I was supposed to come in, get turned out, move on. That has been the shape of the last 2 years, and I had adjusted to it. I was not expecting you." He was very still. "I was not expecting someone who picked up my bag," she said. "I was not expecting someone who checked the legal status before drawing conclusions. I was not expecting someone who sat on a porch in the evening and told me things about his own life." She stopped. She was not good at this. She had not done this in a very long time. "I need you to know that before I go to San Angelo. I need you to know that this has become something else for me. This town, you." She paused. "I do not know what you feel. I do not have any right to assume, but I would rather say it than not say it because I have had enough of silence." Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. She waited. "I told you about Martha," he said. She waited. "I did not tell you how it changed me. When she died, I made a decision. Not consciously. I did not sit down and decide. But somewhere in the months after, I closed something in myself and told myself it was practical. That the kind of thing we had was too expensive. That I could not afford to build something and lose it again." He looked at his hands, turning his hat slowly. "I have been carrying that for 5 years, and I did not notice how heavy it was until about 3 weeks ago, when a woman came into this town with everything she owned in one bag and a face that looked like it had forgotten what rest felt like. And I looked at her, and I felt something I had told myself I was done with." She was very still. "I am not a man who speaks easily about these things," he said. And now he looked at her, and the gray eyes were open in a way she had not seen them before. "But I think you should know that when I say I hope you come back from San Angelo, I mean it as more than a professional courtesy." She reached over and covered his hand with hers. It was a small gesture, her hand against his, on the flat rock at the base of the limestone ridge, with the evening coming down around them and the town spread out below. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a long time without speaking, and it was the most important silence she had been in for years. She went to San Angelo the following week on the Tuesday stage. Isaiah rode with her to the stage stop, which she did not ask him to do but which she was glad of, and he handed her up with a formality that was also something else. And she looked at him from the window as the stage pulled away, and he was standing with his hat in his hand, and Ezra the hound at his feet, and he watched her until she was out of sight. The federal marshal's office in San Angelo was a one-room building with a desk and 2 deputies and a marshal named Forsyth, who was a spare man with a mustache and the careful eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating people quickly. She gave him the letter. He read it. He pulled out a file and read something in that. He looked at her. "Mrs. Wallace," he said, "your husband has been considerably forthcoming in his statement to the federal authorities in New Mexico. I believe he was motivated less by conscience than by the hope of a reduced sentence, but the consequence for your situation is the same regardless of his motivation." He took a stamp and pressed it to a document on his desk with the sound of something final. "The inquiry against you is formally closed as of today. I am having the territorial posters withdrawn by wire this afternoon." She took the document he slid across the desk to her. It was official and stamped and bore the seal of the United States Marshals Service. She looked at it and felt a complex and not entirely comfortable emotion, which was the specific feeling of something you have wanted for so long that getting it does not feel the way you expected it to. "Do you have any questions?" he asked. "No," she said. Thank you. She walked out into the San Angelo afternoon with the document in her bag and stood in the street for a moment, looking at the sky. James Wallace was in federal custody. Her name was cleared. She was, for the first time in 2 years, simply herself again. Letitia Wallace, a woman of 24, educated and skilled and alone, standing in a West Texas street in the spring of 1882 with her whole life available and the very clear knowledge of exactly where she wanted to go. She found a hotel for the night and sent a wire to Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house for Isaiah because she did not know if she should send it to the sheriff's office. She wrote, "Matter formally resolved. Returning Thursday stage. Letitia." His reply came within 2 hours, which was faster than the wire office usually turned things around, which told her something. It said, "Good, I will meet the stage. Isaiah." She read it twice and put it in her bag with the marshal's document and smiled at her reflection in the hotel window. The ride back was long and hot, and she did not mind any of it. He was at the stage stop when the Thursday stage pulled in, as promised, standing in the afternoon heat with his hat on and Ezra the hound beside him. And when she stepped down, he was there and they looked at each other, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was done being careful. He took her bag. It was a simple thing, a practical thing, but it was also the same gesture as the beginning, and she thought he knew that. They walked back into town together, and the people who saw them could see something that had shifted, some declaration made in posture and proximity, and Clara Beaumont, who saw them pass the land office window, would later say to her husband that she had known it was coming and she was very glad of it. They walked together in the warm evening to the boarding house, and on the porch she turned to him and said, "I have my document. My name is cleared. I have no legal reason to stay in Calder's Creek." "No," he agreed. "I have a personal reason," she said. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were not quite so carefully contained as they had been 3 weeks ago. "What personal reason is that?" he asked. "You," she said. He kissed her then, which was not what she expected him to do, because he was a man of considerable restraint, but it was also exactly what she expected him to do, because he was also a man who, when he made a decision, made it thoroughly. It was a careful kiss, tender and precise, and when he pulled back he was looking at her with the expression she had been watching develop for weeks, the one that was not neutral, the one that was not the sheriff's careful professional attention, but something that was entirely his own. "I was hoping that was the reason," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep, and she thought she had not laughed like that in a very long time. The summer that followed was the kind of summer that you store up against the coming winters. Letitia stayed in Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house while she and Isaiah moved through the careful stages of a courtship conducted in a small town where everyone was watching, which required a certain decorum but which was also, she found, rather sweet in its formality. He came to take her to church on Sundays. He came to the boarding house for supper twice a week, which Mrs. Aldridge permitted with a benign approval and an extra helping of whatever was on the table. They walked in the evenings and talked in the way of two people who had found in each other the rare thing, which was someone genuinely worth talking to. She told him the full story of her marriage, not the summary she had been giving people but the actual story, the details. The moment she had first suspected something was wrong, and the rationalizations she had made, and the specific morning she had woken up and found him gone. He listened without interrupting and without offering the false comfort of premature reassurance, and when she finished he said simply, "You were not stupid. You were deceived by a skilled deceiver. Those are different things." "I know," she said. "I know that now." He told her, in the gradual way he had of giving things, the full story of his life in Calder's Creek, the years of being the son of the town drunk, the specific cruelty of children who have been given permission by their parents to look down on someone, the way his mother had kept her head up with a dignity that he had spent his whole adult life trying to deserve. He told her about Martha, the full version, not the careful abbreviated one, the 3 years they had together, and the winter she got sick, and the 6 days between the first real symptoms and the end. He talked about it with the steadiness of someone who has been through the worst of the grief and is now carrying what remains, which is not nothing but is also not the original wound. "I am sorry," she said. "I know," he said. "She would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for pretense either." This moved Letitia in a way she had not expected, and she was quiet for a moment before saying, "Is that why you told me I could stay? When I arrived, because of her." He considered this honestly. "Partly," he said, "not entirely. Mostly because you were standing there with everything you owned in one bag and a gun at your head, and you were not begging and you were not crying, and you were not performing any emotion at all, and that told me something about what you had been through. It told me that whatever had been done to you was not recent. It was long enough that you had built a shell around it." He paused. "And it seemed to me that you deserved better than to keep building the shell thicker." She took his hand then, and he took hers, and they walked on in the evening with the sky going red and orange above the ridge. He asked her to marry him in August. It was not an elaborate occasion. They were sitting on the porch of the boarding house on a Sunday evening after supper, and the night was warm and full of the sound of insects, and Ezra the hound was asleep across both their feet simultaneously, which said something about the hound's ambitions, and Isaiah turned to her and said, "I would like to ask you something." "All right," she said. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I do not have an elaborate speech. I have thought about this for some time, and I think you already know what I feel, and I think I know what you feel, and I am a man who, when he is sure of something, does not see the virtue of pretending he is still making up his mind." He looked at her steadily. "I love you, Letitia, and I think this town is yours now as much as it is mine, and I would very much like to build something with you in it." She looked at him for a moment. The light was soft and gold, and the insects were singing their August song, and Ezra's large warm weight was across her feet. "Yes," she said. "Of course, yes." He smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that she had been waiting to see, the complete one, the one that had been mostly contained behind the gray eyes and the careful stillness. It changed his whole face, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was the most genuinely handsome man she had ever seen, and that she had been too frightened for too long to notice. They were married in October. The church was small and smelled of wood and the particular dry sweetness of a West Texas autumn, and Clara Beaumont stood with Letitia as her matron of honor, and Wilhelm Hess stood with Isaiah as his best man, which was a pairing that Letitia found deeply touching, given that Hess communicated mostly in monosyllables and approving silences. The Reverend was a gaunt and sincere man named Brothers, who performed the ceremony with a genuine pleasure that spoke to his fondness for Isaiah. Letitia wore a dress she had made herself, because of course she did. It was ivory cotton with small embroidered flowers at the collar, and she had her dark hair up, and a small spray of late autumn wildflowers pinned to it that Clara had helped her arrange. She did not have a veil, because she had decided she was done with anything that obscured her view. She walked up the aisle to Isaiah and looked at him standing there with his good coat and his hair combed, and his gray eyes watching her with an expression of such complete and unguarded feeling that she had to take a breath before she could walk the rest of the way. The ceremony was short, and the words were the traditional words, but when she said them to him specifically, to this specific man, and she meant them with a precision that felt nothing like the words she had said in another church years ago, which she now understood she had said to an idea rather than a person. He said them back to her, and she believed them. After the ceremony the town fed them, which was how small towns marked their important occasions, in the street outside the church, with tables brought out and food contributed by most of the households in Calder's Creek. Roy Tesler was notably absent, which no one mentioned and everyone noticed. Mrs. Aldridge cried quietly and claimed it was the dust. Clara Beaumont laughed a great deal and drank a great deal of the lemonade, which Letitia suspected had been improved upon. Isaiah danced with her in the street in the October evening, in the light of the lanterns that had been hung for the occasion, and he danced with the same quality he did everything, which was quietly and precisely and with full attention, and she put her head against his shoulder for one long moment and felt the absolute specific peace of being exactly where she was supposed to be. They moved into the sheriff's house, which the town owned and provided as part of Isaiah's compensation. It was a modest house, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a small front porch, and it needed things done to it, which Letitia saw immediately with the practical eye of a woman who had been making do with what was available for some time and was now in a position to improve things. She made curtains. She arranged his books. She negotiated a better stove with the town council, which she attended in her capacity as the sheriff's wife, and also as a citizen of Calder's Creek with fully cleared legal status and a very good ability to make a persuasive argument. The winter came in gently that year, not the harsh kind but the West Texas variety, cold at night and bright in the days, with the sky the clean, bright blue of polished copper. She continued working at Hess's store because she liked working and she was good at it, and Isaiah did not have any objection to this, which was itself a kind of statement about the man he was. Clara Beaumont continued to be her friend and continued to bring gossip with the regularity of a reliable newspaper, and Letitia continued to sit on the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed. Only now Isaiah was in the other chair by right rather than by the convenient logic of evening rounds. She found out she was pregnant in January. She told him in the evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, setting down the cup of coffee she had been holding and saying, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her with the attentive stillness. "I am going to have a child," she said. He was quiet for a full 3 seconds, which for Isaiah was a long silence. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, and he said, "Are you well?" She had not expected that to be the first question. She had expected something more demonstrative. But it was such an exactly right first question, so completely him, that she felt tears in her eyes before she had time to prevent them. "Yes," she said, "I am very well." Then he smiled, the complete smile, and his hand tightened on hers, and he said, "Good," and she laughed and the tears came down anyway, and she did not mind them. He was attentive during the pregnancy in the way of a man who takes everything seriously that deserves seriousness, which was considerable. He negotiated with her about what she should and should not carry. He lost this negotiation more often than not, because Letitia had strong views on her own physical capability, but he made his positions known, and she found that she enjoyed the negotiation. The summer was hot, as West Texas summers were, in a way that sat heavily on a woman in her later months of pregnancy. She spent more time on the porch in the evenings because the house held the heat and the porch gave up the day's warmth faster. Isaiah sat with her and fanned her and brought her cold water from the well and read to her sometimes from whatever book he was currently in, and she thought, on a particular evening in July with the heat lightning flickering out over the flat country and the stars coming out above the ridge, that she had never been as happy as this. Not in the uncomplicated way of a young girl who does not know what can go wrong. In the full and complicated way of a person who does know and has chosen to be here anyway. Their son was born in August of 1883. The birth was difficult. She was not going to pretend otherwise or smooth it into sentiment. It was long and painful, and the midwife who attended, a capable woman named Mrs. Parrow who had been birthing babies in this county for 20 years, kept her face professionally calm throughout, which was what Letitia needed from her. Isaiah was in the front room because that was what was done, and she could hear him there, pacing, which was the first time she had ever known him to pace, which told her more than anything about the depth of what he felt. When it was over and Mrs. Parrow put the baby into her arms, Letitia looked at him. He was small and red and insistently loud, which seemed to her like a promising sign. He had the look of a new person who was completely uncertain about this world and fully committed to making his uncertainties known. "Hello," she said to him. "You were quite a lot of trouble." Isaiah was allowed in then, and she watched him cross the room and look at his son, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on him before, which was a kind of wonder so unguarded that it made the careful gray eyes look young. He sat beside her and she leaned against him, the baby between them, and he said, "What do you want to name him?" She had been thinking about this. "Thomas," she said, "for your mother's father, as you told me about him." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the right name." Thomas Rourke was not an easy baby. He was demanding and energetic and full of opinions from the very beginning, which everyone agreed was his mother's influence and which Letitia considered a reasonable assessment. Isaiah proved to be a father in the same way he was everything else: quiet, attentive, fully present. He walked Thomas in the small hours when the baby would not sleep, and he did it without complaint and often without waking Letitia first, which she only discovered when she woke and found the bed empty and heard him in the front room, speaking very quietly to the baby, a low, one-sided conversation conducted with complete seriousness. She stood in the doorway one night and listened to him say, "I know you have concerns. They are legitimate concerns. Being a new person is very difficult. I can attest to this, but I need you to understand that you are in good hands." She went back to bed before he heard her, and she lay there in the warm dark and thought that the universe had done something remarkable, which was arrange things so that a woman who had been told no by 17 towns and run off all of them had ended up in this particular town at this particular time with this particular man. Thomas grew with the uncomplicated speed that babies grow, and the town watched him with the proprietary fondness of a small community that has invested in a story and likes the way it is going. Clara Beaumont spoiled him relentlessly and claimed she was not doing so. Mrs. Aldridge made him a blanket. Wilhelm Hesse, who had never to anyone's knowledge made a lavish gesture, carved a small wooden horse and left it on the doorstep without explanation. Roy Tesler had left Calder's Creek in the spring of 1883, not in response to any particular event, but in the quiet economic logic of a man who had not thrived here and had other options. Letitia did not mourn this development. The town, relieved of the presence of its most determined grudge holder, settled into the easy relationship with her that had been available to it all along. She was, by the spring of 1884, thoroughly woven into the fabric of Calder's Creek. She had expanded her accounting work at Hess's store into a more formal arrangement that included 3 other businesses, and she had taught an informal sewing class to a group of women who came on Wednesday afternoons, and she had joined the committee for the church social, which she had done partly for the community, and partly because Clara Beaumont had looked at her with a very specific expression of need. She had also, in the quiet way of someone building something durable, made the sheriff's house into a home. This was not only the curtains and the improved stove, though those mattered. It was the accumulated texture of a life lived in a place, the worn spot on the front step from their feet and Ezra's nails, the particular way the light came in the kitchen window in the morning, and made it worth getting up for, the shelf that now held both Isaiah's books and hers combined in a comfortable arrangement that made no clear distinction between his and hers, which she thought was an accurate description of what a marriage should be. Isaiah had been re-elected sheriff in the fall of 1883 with what passed in Calder's Creek for a landslide, which was to say, near unanimity. He took this with the modesty of a man who does not mistake approval for inherent worth, and was simply glad to continue doing work he believed in. He came home one evening in the early spring of 1884 with the expression she had learned to read as something requiring discussion, which was a slight additional stillness, a quality of having arranged his thoughts before he arrived. "There is going to be a rail expansion," he said, after supper, when Thomas was asleep and they were alone. "The rail company is running a new line through this part of the territory. It is going to come through Calder's Creek." She looked at him. "That is good news for the town." "It is," he agreed. "It is also going to bring people, considerably more people and considerably more quickly than the town is used to. That is going to change things." She understood what he was saying. "You are thinking about what changed in Abilene when the cattle drive started, What changes in a town when it becomes a crossing point? Yes. Do you think it is going to be a problem? He was quiet for a moment. I think it is going to require preparation, he said. I think the town is going to need more than one lawman, and I have already spoken to the mayor about hiring a deputy. And I think, he paused, I think Calder's Creek has the bones to be something good even when it gets larger. If we are careful with it. She looked at him across the table. We, she said. He looked at her with a directness that was still, even now, something she felt in her chest. We, he confirmed. She smiled. Then we will be careful with it, she said. The rail came through in the summer of 1884, and with it came exactly what Isaiah had predicted, an influx of new residents, new businesses, new complications. A new hotel went up on the main street, and a second general store, and a land rush of the specific energetic chaos that follows anywhere that starts to look like a future. Isaiah hired a deputy named Cord, a steady young man from a ranching family in the county, and trained him with the same care he brought to everything. Letitia watched her town grow and felt, each time she used the word her town, the small private satisfaction of knowing what it meant. She had a town. She had not had one in 2 years, and she had this one now, and she meant to keep it. She found out she was pregnant again in the fall of 1884, which she had been half expecting and was entirely glad of. Thomas, who was 1 year old and walking with the joyous confidence of someone who has just discovered an ability and sees no reason not to use it constantly, was indifferent to this news as a news event but would benefit from the result. This pregnancy was easier, or perhaps she was more confident in her body's knowledge. She continued working, continued teaching the sewing class, continued being on the church social committee despite Clara Beaumont's concern that she was doing too much. She was not doing too much. She was doing exactly what she had the capacity for, which she considered herself the best judge of. Isaiah was attentive in the way she was accustomed to from the first pregnancy, and also in the way of a man who was simultaneously trying to manage the expansion of a growing town's law enforcement needs, which meant that he came home sometimes with the look of a man who has been carrying a great deal and needs to put it down, and she was glad to be the place he could put it down. They talked more in this period than perhaps in any other. The evenings on the porch, which were a fixed point of their days, became the space where they worked through everything: the town, the future, the specific delights and frustrations of raising Thomas, the occasional letter that arrived from various quarters with updates on the James Wallace trial. He had been convicted in the spring of 1884 on 8 counts of fraud and sentenced to 6 years in the federal penitentiary, and when she had received the letter informing her of this, she had held it for a moment and then put it down and said to Isaiah, "I do not feel as much as I thought I would." "What do you feel?" he asked. "Finished," she said, "like a door that has been closed fully." He nodded as though this was the right answer. "I am glad he is answered for," she said. "I am more glad that I spent no more of my days on him than I already did." Isaiah had looked at her with the expression she loved best, the one that was fully open. "You are the most clear-headed person I have ever known," he said. "Practical," she said. "My mother called it restless. The years have called it practical." "I call it remarkable," he said. She had laughed, and he had taken her hand over the supper table, over the remains of the meal, and they had sat like that in the kitchen of the house that was theirs, with the evening settling around Calder's Creek, and it was one of the quiet moments she was already adding to the collection she kept in the place. She kept the things she did not want to lose. Their daughter was born in June of 1885. This birth was faster and more decisive than Thomas's had been. Mrs. Perrow arrived, did her work, and 2 hours after she arrived there was a daughter, with dark hair like Letitia's and eyes that would, in the coming weeks, settle into a shade of gray very nearly identical to her father's. Isaiah came in and sat beside her and looked at this daughter the same way he had looked at Thomas, with the unguarded wonder. "She looks like you," he said. "She has your eyes," Letitia said. "Or she will." They named her Clara Ruth, the Clara for Clara Beaumont, who when informed of this burst into tears at the boarding house porch where they told her and then insisted it was the dust again, and the Ruth for Isaiah's mother, who had kept her head up in hard times and deserved to have her name carried forward. Thomas, who was 2 years old and had opinions about everything, regarded his sister with an expression of scientific neutrality for approximately 3 days, and then made a decision in her favor, sitting beside her and patting her with a heavy gentleness whenever the opportunity arose, which the adults found deeply endearing and tried not to show excessively for fear of encouraging the behavior into performance. The years moved with the quality that good years have, which is not slowness exactly but fullness, so full that there is no room for the drag of time. The town grew with the rail line, and Isaiah managed its growth with the care of a man who had decided what he wanted this place to be and was willing to work for it. Letitia's accounting business grew with the town, and by 1886 she was the bookkeeper of record for 11 businesses and had hired a young woman named Nell Garrett to help with the work, which gave her the additional satisfaction of providing employment to someone who needed it. She thought sometimes about the other 16 towns, the ones that had said no. She thought about them without bitterness mostly. There was occasional bitterness. She was human. But mostly she thought about them the way you think about roads that led you where you were going, not the destinations in themselves, but the path between the beginning and the end. In the fall of 1886, there was a moment that she thought about for a long time afterward. She was at the general store, doing the accounts with the Wednesday precision that the work required, and a woman came in on the San Angelo stage, a young woman of about 20 with a carpet bag and the expression of someone who has been traveling a long way and is not sure what is waiting at the end. She stood at the counter and asked if there was a boarding house, and Letitia looked up and saw herself, not exactly, not literally, but in the essential shape of it, the careful neutral expression that was armor, the single bag, the look of someone who had learned not to expect welcome. She put down her pen. "Mrs. Aldridge's boarding house," she said. "Corner of 2nd and Main. Tell her Letitia sent you. She will take care of you." The woman looked at her. "Thank you," she said, with the specific weight of someone who means it more than the words usually carry. She went back to her accounts when the woman left, but she was not really looking at the numbers. She was thinking about what it meant to be in a position to do that, to pass the thing forward, the simple thing that Isaiah had done for her, which was say you can stay here and mean it. That evening she told him about it on the porch and he listened, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Did you tell her to come see me if she needed anything?" "I did not," Letitia said. "I will check in on her," he said, not because the woman was a problem. Because she might need to know someone was looking out for her. "That is why I married you," Letitia said. He turned and looked at her with the gray eyes and the slight smile that was one of the things she most loved about him, the contained version that preceded the complete one. "Just for that," he said. "Among other things," she said. He took her hand in the evening air, there on the porch of the house that was theirs, with the limestone ridge going gold in the autumn light, and the sound of Thomas and Clara Ruth inside at their supper, and Ezra the hound, elderly now and slower but still definitively official, asleep across the threshold. In the spring of 1887, something happened that she had not anticipated, but that, when it happened, seemed entirely fitting. A man came through Calder's Creek on his way from San Antonio to Points West, and he stopped at Hess's store, and he had the air of a man passing through, and when he gave his name to Wilhelm Hess for the account, it was a name that Letitia heard from the back room where she was working, and she went still. The name was not James Wallace. It was a name she recognized from the years before James, a name from St. Louis, a man who had been a friend of her father's, an old man now if he was still alive. The name was not James. She checked herself and took a breath, but it was a reminder that the past was a country you had traveled through and did not need to return to. She was not standing in that saloon doorway anymore with her hands raised. She was in the back room of a general store in her own town with her own accounts and her children at home and a husband who was, at this moment, making his afternoon rounds with a deputy and a large self-satisfied elderly hound, and she was not frightened of anyone who walked through any door. She went back to her accounts. In September of 1887, Letitia discovered she was expecting a third child. This she told Isaiah on the porch, which had become their habitual place for important news, and he received it with the grace of a man who had discovered that the things he had been afraid to build again were the things most worth having. "Thomas is going to be very authoritative about this," Isaiah said. "Thomas is very authoritative about everything," Letitia said. "He is," Isaiah agreed. "He gets it from his mother." She laughed, and he was smiling the complete smile, the unconstrained one, and she thought, as she had thought on many occasions, that the specific quality of his happiness, when he allowed it to be fully visible, was one of the most beautiful things she had seen in her life. Their second son was born in April of 1888, which was Thomas's fifth spring and Clara Ruth's third, and he came into the world with the decisive energy that seemed to be a characteristic of their children, and they named him William, for no ancestor in particular, but because it was a strong and honest name, and he had arrived in a strong and honest way. Mrs. Parrow, who had now delivered 3 Rourke children, said at the birth that she had never had a family be so efficiently grateful, by which she meant that Isaiah's quiet thank you after each birth had the specific quality of genuine feeling entirely contained, which she found more moving than displays. The family was 5 now, 3 children, 2 parents, 1 aging hound of immense personal dignity, and they filled the sheriff's house in a way that required some creative thinking about space. But Letitia was good at creative thinking about space, and Isaiah was good at building things, which she had discovered in the second year of their marriage, when she had mentioned that the back of the house could use another room, and he had, over the course of the following summer, and with the assistance of a neighbor with carpentry skills, made it happen. Calder's Creek in 1888 was a different town than it had been in 1882, larger and busier, and connected to the larger world by the rail line and by the news that came with commerce. It had a school now, which had been one of Isaiah's consistent arguments with the town council, and Thomas was in it with the enthusiasm of a child who had grown up in a house full of books and had his mother's conviction that knowing things was its own reward. Clara Ruth would be in it the following year. The school was Letitia's particular joy. She donated books to it regularly, and she had, in a negotiation with the town council that she considered one of her best, arranged for the school to have a dedicated account that drew on a small levy from the businesses whose books she kept, all of whom had agreed to this with more grace than she had expected, because she had asked them with the directness of a woman who knew what she was asking and why it mattered. On the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, October of 1888, Isaiah came home from his rounds and found the supper table set with what candles they had, and the children fed and put to bed by Mrs. Aldridge, who had come over for this specific purpose, and then gone home with the air of a woman who has done something she is pleased with. He stopped at the door of the kitchen and looked at her and the candles and the supper on the table and said, "I should go and try to arrest someone so that you can rescue me more regularly." She laughed, and he sat down, and they ate by candlelight, which in a West Texas October was also pleasant lamplight because the windows were open and the night air came in, and they talked about the years in the way of people who have lived something rather than survived it. "If I had not come to Calder's Creek," she said at one point. "But you did," he said. "No, but the 17th town was here because 16 others were not, which means every door that closed pushed me in this direction." He was quiet for a moment. "I have thought about that," he said, "and I am grateful to be number 17, but I am also angry at numbers 1 through 16 on your behalf because they had no right to treat you the way they did, and the fact that it led you here does not make what they did acceptable." She looked at him across the candlelight. "I know," she said. "I contain both things, the gratitude and the anger, they coexist. "Good," he said, "they should." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same gesture as the first time, the kitchen table, the evening settling around them. "I love you," he said, with the directness that was his characteristic mode, the declaration made as fact. "I love you," she said back, and meant it in the full accounting sense, the complete ledger, everything added up to this number which was the right one. The years moved forward and the town grew, and the children grew, and Isaiah's hair went more silver, and Letitia found a first white strand in her own dark hair in the spring of 1890, and considered it entirely fair. They had lived something by then, enough to show for it. Thomas was a boy who asked questions about everything with the relentless curiosity of a child raised on books and conversation, and who would, Letitia thought, go east for education someday and come back something impressive. Clara Ruth was a girl of serious eyes and her father's patience and her mother's precision, who was the child most likely to sit quietly in the corner during adult conversations, and then later repeat something that had been said with a clarity of retention that was sometimes inconvenient. William was the youngest and knew it, which manifested as a charming confidence in his ability to win over anyone in any room, a quality that both his parents recognized from different sources and found alternately endearing and exhausting. Ezra the Hound passed away peacefully in the summer of 1890, in the shade of the front porch, and this was mourned by the entire family with the specific grief of a beloved animal who has been part of a life's furniture. Isaiah buried him in the small yard behind the house, and the children helped, and it was a proper ceremony. Isaiah stood at the head of the small grave with his hat in his hands and said, "He was a good dog and an excellent deputy, and he is missed." And this was all that needed to be said. A new dog arrived the following spring, a younger hound of no official name who acquired the name Moses by the children's consensus, and who took up the position of household authority with a seriousness that suggested he understood the legacy he was filling. In the fall of 1890, Isaiah was asked by the county commissioner to consider standing for county sheriff, a larger position covering a wider territory and carrying more authority. He brought this to Letitia on the porch on an October evening with the look of a man who has a genuine question. "What do you think?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "I think you have been doing exactly this work for almost 9 years, she said. "I think you are very good at it, and that a larger territory means more people who benefit from the way you do it. I think the town is in good shape and Cord has become an excellent lawman in his own right." She looked at him. "I think it would require more travel." "Yes," he said. "I think that is manageable," she said. "You would have to handle more of the household business on your own." "Isaiah," she said patiently, "I have been managing business since before we met. I am capable." "I know you are," he said. "I am asking because your life would change and you deserve the question." She took his hand. "Stand for it," she said. "This is what you were made for. I will be here." He was elected county sheriff in December of 1890 by a significant margin, and the town of Calder's Creek threw a party that had the quality of a community sending one of its own out to do something larger than itself, with pride and some proprietorial satisfaction, because Calder's Creek had decided that Isaiah Rourke was theirs even when he was everyone else's too. The work expanded, as work does when you are good at it. He traveled more, to the eastern and western corners of the county, and came home with the tiredness of a man who has been carrying a great deal and the look of a man who knows where he is going. She was always there when he came back, and the light in the window was real, and the children came running, and the supper was on the stove, and he came through the door, and she could see him set down the weight of the county in the threshold as he stepped in. "Home," he said sometimes, "just the word, the way you say a word when you have come back to it after a distance." "Home," she agreed. In the spring of 1892, exactly 10 years after Letitia Wallace had stepped off a stage in Calder's Creek, with everything she owned in one bag and a name that had been used against her in 16 towns, She stood on the front porch of the house that was hers, and looked out at the town that was hers too, and took stock of the accounting. 3 children, 7 and 9 and 4 years old respectively, all healthy, all full of the specific and demanding life of children who have been given the confidence of being loved. A husband who was still, a decade in, the most genuinely good man she had ever known, and who still occasionally sat on the flat rock at the base of the limestone ridge with his hat in his hands and looked out at the flat country, and who she still went and sat beside when she found him there. A community that was hers, built from nothing, built from the specific raw material of a woman who had been told no too many times, and had kept going anyway and arrived somewhere that said yes. She heard the door behind her and felt him before she turned, the specific gravity of him, and he stood beside her on the porch with his coffee in his hand and looked at the town with her. "What are you thinking about?" he said. 17, she said. He understood. He always understood her. "I am thinking," she said, "about the specific luck of a bad run that ends in the right place." "It was not luck," he said. "No, you kept going," he said. 16 times you could have stopped. You did not stop. That is not luck. That is something you did." She looked at him, at the silver in his hair and the quiet in his gray eyes and the way he held his coffee the same way he held everything, with attention. "You said I could stay," she said. "You deserve to stay," he said. "The other 16 were wrong. I was simply the first one to be right." She leaned against him, there on the porch of the house they had built in the town that was theirs, and he put his arm around her. And the morning came on over the limestone ridge in the pink and gold way of West Texas mornings, which are extravagant and unapologetic about it. And the children were inside making the sounds of children beginning a day, and Moses the hound was asleep across the front step in an exact repetition of his predecessor. And the town of Calder's Creek was waking up and beginning its commerce and its conversations and its life. She had been looking for a place to stop for 2 years. She had been looking for a place where she was not the problem, where she could wake up and do the day without spending every hour proving she deserved to be standing on the ground she was standing on. She had found it. She was standing on it right now, with his arm around her and the morning coming in, and the whole long journey from Wichita to here had resolved itself into this specific morning on this specific porch, and the accounting was clean, all columns balanced, nothing outstanding. She was home. She was fully, completely, finally home. And the woman who had been turned away from 16 towns and run off every one of them was standing in the 17th one, which was the right one, which was hers, and she was not going anywhere at all.